Thank you for inviting me, everybody. In the early 20th century, Fred Saxton looked back over his own life and his mother's life. He was a coal miner in the north of England, and he remembered how his mother, her own mother, had died, and so she was left as a teenager to be a housekeeper to her father and a general servant to her household, which included her 3 coal mining brothers. And Fred remarked that she actually ended up working 17-hour days in this household, and that this molded her and branded her in the ways in which she could then engage with her own household later, and constrained her life. We might come back to Mrs. Saxton later on, but I want to actually back away from her now a little bit, because this paper is about the causes and consequences of how women came to be in these positions where they worked very, very long days in these coal mining families. But the paper didn't come about, it wasn't intended originally as a paper on gender or on time use. Originally, Raya and I were working on deprivation, and we were correlating modern day deprivation in regions, in areas, with coal mining intensity. And one interesting thing that we found in this standard spatial statistical analysis was that deprivation, measured today by a multiple index of deprivation, was more strongly correlated with the date when coal mines opened than when they closed. So we deduced from this that deprivation in coal mining communities, which is widespread right across Europe, all European coal mining areas have had great difficulties in regenerating themselves, is more to do with how coal mining was organized and not simply to do with the demise of particular pits. It's more to do with the way in which coal communities emerged and developed. Fabrice was showing me some pictures earlier. This is a picture actually of the coal mining village that I come from. And in fact, a house my grandmother lived in is shown in this picture. This is when the village was being rejuvenated. So what Raya and I went on to think about was to invert a very standard story that development economists tell about how the empowerment of women creates growth. And they have 2 pathways. One is through the market. So the argument is that if you empower women in households, they will go out and get jobs, and then there'll be a more efficient allocation of resources in the labour market. That's a kind of market pathway from women's empowerment to faster, more rapid growth and development. But there's also a pathway through the household, where the argument is that if you empower women in the household, then in fact they will devote resources to children's human capital formation, to children's well-being, and that will also generate growth and development. And what Raya and I started to think about was turning this on its head and arguing that in a context where women are not empowered, this may well constrain growth and development, and this may be a factor in the inability of coal mining communities to, in fact, reinvent themselves in the 21st century and to move beyond the state of deprivation that they experience. So when we thought about this more, we started to look in depth at the way in which coal mining wives and daughters spent their time. And this again seemed to be running up a little bit against the literature, because many of us think of coal mining as a male activity, as a male breadwinner family, and women's activities are really not very high profile in studies of coal mining communities. So in these areas, men see themselves as the breadwinners, supporting the wife and children who didn't work. Traditionally, however, that wasn't the case. And today I'm going to argue that until the late 20th century, profits and wages in coal mining were propped up by significant amounts of labour displaced onto domestic workers. This is a quote from a coal miner. You can see here, he says, "Oh, I wish I could swap jobs with our lass." This is from a very famous study, sociological study of a coal mining community. And if he's representing here the standard view of the coal miner, that he's the one who works, and the wife is very lucky because all she does is stay at home and look after the home. And here's another famous quotation from captured by a guy called Kirkup, who was collecting these kinds of comments. And this is somebody who says, well, we thought women were really lucky. They didn't have to go down the pit. And then he does actually say, he's 87 at the point when he's making these comments, and then he does actually say, well, later on we realised that they actually did do quite a lot of work. Now, what we argue in the paper is that this work is not simply the reproduction of labour. This isn't about simply domestic work to reproduce labour power. That in fact, in what we're going to try and argue, is a close reading of sources suggests that miners' wives and their daughters played an important role. We know that. That's been established by sociological studies, who people like Valerie Hall, for instance, people like Griselda Carr, who have shown that that coal miners' wives and daughters did do a lot of work within their households. But we don't really know what kind of work they were doing and how it fits into the story of the coal mining community. And we're going to try and argue that this is not simply domestic work reproducing the family, reproducing labour power. This is actually work which fits in with coal mining production. So this is actually propping up the profits as well of the colliery companies, as well as the wages of the coal miner. Well, the larger paper is organised as shown on this slide. So what the paper does is we describe the historical involvement of the family in coal mining and the emergence of men's individual ownership of the wage. And then we report a time study, a time use study of women, wives and daughters of coal miners. So this is actually drilling down into how they spend their time. And we apply this time use study to a series of cross-sections using census data. So this is following some families through various British censuses and using historical evidence, standard evidence on earnings and hours to show, in fact, to compare the hours of work that women and men do in textile households relative to coal mining households. And the results are quite surprising, because we find that actually coal mining women tend to work longer hours than women who have jobs in the textile sector. We might come back to that. And we also then examine evidence that suggests that in British coal mining areas, female labour force participation rates remain much lower than the national average, and we argue that this is in fact the legacy of some of the experience that I'm going to document today. And we conclude that economists and policymakers, of course, as usual, overlooked the importance of gender in understanding the forces that hold back particular communities, and really need to pay attention to the ways in which whole households were involved in coal mining activities. And I'm speaking today, yesterday, the British Parliament decided to give permission to open a new coal mine in Whitehaven. You might have seen this on the news. And to great acclaim from local community leaders who want to see jobs and regeneration through the opening up of a new and modern coal mine in an age when, you know, we know the dangers of fossil fuel. It's just amazing. But what I want to focus on today, since I've only got the 45 minutes, is to look at the time use study. So this is going to zero in on the ways in which coal mining women use their time in their households. And first we're going to situate household labour in the historical context of coal mining in England and how female labour came to be seen as free labour, even as men came to see the wages that they earned as their own, their individual wage. And then move on to the core of the paper, which is this time use study. And one of the issues, though, is that how households responded to the labour demanded of them is also very important, and that's why we then took on this comparison of coal mining families and textile families. And finally, of course, there is this issue of the need to impress upon policymakers the importance of studying gender relationships in particular production contexts. Okay. So what I'm going to do today then is I'm going to describe the historical context, and I'm going to suggest that we see a transition in English coal mining from a family labour system to, in fact, male breadwinning. And then I'm going to move on from that to report the time use study. And this involves examples of some key activities. One is the bath, the shift bath. Once you start working on coal miners, people who are here and working on coal mines will know that one of the things you always encounter is pictures, photographs, paintings, documentation of the miner's bath before the fire, after the shift. And the shift laundry, another very significant trope in writings on coal miners. I'm going to look at a time budget study, and this is going to involve thinking about how much labour went into supporting one miner in a household. But then we're going to look at something which I've called here the multipliers. And this is when we get more than one miner in a household. Remember, Mrs. Saxton had her father and her 3 brothers to cater to. So we're going to talk about how, in fact, the workload increases when you get more than one coal miner in the household. And the multipliers are also involved because it's not simply getting additional coal miners in the household, but those coal miners are working different shifts. So the shift patterns and shift labour more generally is in fact imposing another burden on women in coal mining households. And in particular, one of the things we're going to argue here is that the colliery companies, in order to exploit their much deeper coal mines and the mechanised equipment, want to work continuously, and this is the reason for the introduction of a shift system. But then they leave the organisation of the shift, getting men up, getting them out to work, to the wives and daughters of the coal miners. In addition, one of our other interests in the paper is the disamenities of colliery villages. And this goes back to the point I made in my opening remarks about it being very important when the coal mine is actually open, because these communities are very often developed far away from existing centres of population, and so the infrastructure is put in place, if at all, by the colliery company. And of course the colliery company seeks to save expenditures of this kind, or to in fact perhaps provide rudimentary facilities, but then deduct some contribution to these facilities from the coal miners' wages. So coal mining communities in England and elsewhere in Europe lag behind other communities in the development of things like running water, things like sanitation, and of course this then increases the hours of work that women do in these families. And finally, I'm also going to argue that there's yet another way in which the burden is enhanced through these multipliers, and that is because women in those families, in order, and this is to challenge the individuation of the wage that I talked about earlier, women in fact self-exploit. They embellish their own labour time. They seek to, in fact, do tasks which have no particular hygienic return, no particular, sometimes no reason. So they actually want to be seen, to be working, to be contributing. And this leads to a situation where they are very keen to be seen, to never allow their husband to do anything within the home, and to do all kinds of strange tasks. I remember my grandmother in the community that you saw described in the photograph, for instance, chalking the step and putting up white lace curtains, which of course, you know, in a coal mining community, these things last for 5 minutes and they have no hygienic function, but they demonstrate to the rest of the community that this woman is working, you know, to improve, to try and make a statement about the standards that she aspires to. Then, as I say, if I get a chance, I will talk very briefly about mining and textile households in comparison, and I'll talk also about the ways in which female labour force participation lags behind in these communities. And of course, this then suggests that policymakers really have missed something that they really should know about. Okay, so the historical context in the British case is that coal mining historically was a family labour system. The whole family, in fact, went to work at the pit. So early drift and bell mines were just very simple structures, and whole families went and extracted the coal really as they could. But in the 19th century, with deeper pits and mechanisation, women moved out of many coal fields, and they only worked underground in certain coal fields. But the miner did need large numbers of ancillary workers. The roadways needed to be repaired, the air doors needed to be opened and shut as people went through them. Most importantly, the coal had to be transported from the place where the miner, the male hewer, was taking it off the seam to the surface where it was weighed and recorded. And the overhead workers were recruited and paid by the mine owners by and large, but the transport workers were recruited and paid by the coal miners themselves, perhaps in a gesture to that earlier independence in the very initial openings of the coal mining areas. But generally, these transport workers, the hurriers, as they're often called, literally, the hurriers, were the wives and children of the hewers. Now, this system has benefits for both the coal owners and for the miners themselves. For the coal owners, for example, they could designate recruitment. They don't have to bother recruiting transport workers. The miners themselves can do that. Delegating supervision as well. Very difficult to supervise underground labour. If you're a coal owner, you don't want to go down that smelly, disgusting pit yourself and supervise the workers. So this is a way of delegating and as motivating incentivization as well because, of course, the miner himself would want to get the transport workers to get his coal to the surface. And it also distanced the coal owners from the dreadful conditions underground and from the recruitment and work, the exploitation, if you want, of women and children. So when the 1842 Royal Commission investigated these conditions in British coal mines, many of the owners said, oh, it's nothing to do with us. We just hire the miners and they hire the workers themselves. So, of course, it benefited the adult male miners because this was labour that was locally available. It was amenable labour. You could, in fact, exploit your patriarchal and paternalistic position in these households to get the workers to work well, to get your ancillary workers to work well. And it's also perhaps clear that family members were more likely to offer aid if dangerous situations emerged in the operation of the pit, which very often did happen. And it solves what economists call the principal agent problem in transport. That is that the transport workers represented the miner. They made sure that his coal was weighed correctly so that the wage would be accurately related to his productivity. They had an interest in so doing. They represented the interests of the hewer. And of course, above all, there's no need to share the wage. If you had to hire people from outside the family, you would have to share the earnings that you derive from your own activities. Well, as I said, the mines, there's a Royal Commission that turns up these very dramatic findings, and they were actually a new innovation was to illustrate the conditions underground with those woodcuts that I showed along the bottom. And people were very shocked. The elites were very shocked. They hadn't realized women and children were still working below ground in coal mines. And so this caused something, a rather scandalous response, because, of course, some of these woodcuts showed women, for instance, working bare-breasted. And that was, very much more dramatically scandalous for the elite than the actual fact that these women were working in these wretched conditions and doing this enormously heavy labour. So what follows is regulation. It's the Mines Act in 1842 forbids women and girls from working below ground and forbids boys under the age of 10, although the thesis that I'm involved with tomorrow shows that, in fact, this is far from meaning that adolescent boys are removed from coal mines. So what happens then is that the wage continues to now be paid to men who work underground, whereas before the wage was often still paid to the hewer. The fact that the whole family was involved in earning it put constraints on how it could be, in fact, distributed within the family. But now it becomes seen solely as an individual wage, something which the male breadwinner earns. So what I'm arguing here is that this turnaround as a result of regulation is embedded in the individualization of the wage. The wage appeared to be and came to be understood as solely the product of the man's efforts. And this was then reinforced by how it was reckoned. It was reckoned by piece rate. It was reckoned as a result of particularly the amount of coal that the man extracts. So it's literally measured, is the measurers, as they're called in the Welsh coalfield, for instance, are people who measure the actual amount of the seam that the hewer has hacked off. It was also presented as individual in the way it was paid. It was paid to the individual man, often in cash, often in a public house that was owned by the colliery. So you got an immediate feedback into the colliery's own coffers. And it was paid to the man individually. And that notion of the individualization of the male wage was reinforced by male solidarity at work and in leisure. And in some of the evidence that we found that of course, this leads on to something, the way in which the wage is then shared in the household, because the man brings the individual wage into the household. And there's various ways in which this can then be shared with the wife and the children in working class communities, and these have been explored by sociologists and historians. In the miner's household, sometimes in some areas, the men give the whole wage to the wife. That's known as the whole wage system. In some areas, they give the wife the housekeeping, and in other areas, they in fact give the wife what's left after they've had their own top cut. And these systems are associated with particular coalfields, but by and large, even if the man shares the wage, it's viewed as being generosity on his part. So that we found some really lovely examples of how the men, when they got together, they would in fact discuss ways in which they could lower the wife's part of the earnings. And the part, even when they gave the whole wage to the wife, there was something that in the Durham coalfield is called the keepy back, a rather nice little expression, the keepy back, and they would try and enhance the keepy back, what they reserved for themselves. And they would get up to all kinds of devious tricks, like they would look on the floor of the pay office and find an extra pay slip that was somebody else's pay slip that showed a lower pay. So then they could show this to the wife, and that would then, they could then keep more as part of the keepy back. But this also leads to a money antagonism, is the way the sociologists have written about it, between the miner and his wife. Because he sees the wage as his own, and he's generously sharing it with her. So another very interesting exchange that we discovered in some primary sources is when a woman describes how she asks her husband for money to run the household, and he says, "You want that? You put boots on." In other words, he's done his job, he's earned the money, and he's just giving her what he wants to give her, and he's not going to give her any more. And if she wants more, she has to go down the pit, which of course is impossible in these conditions. So this leads to what Wally Seckham has called breadwinner abuse, that you can, in fact, if you see yourself as the breadwinner and these women and children as in fact your dependents, then in fact there is an antagonism set up here. So what we're arguing is then that after 1842, mining communities actually retained the family labour systems of the past, but this is obscured by these new divisions of labour and a mode of remuneration that focused on only one part of the collective effort needed to earn the wage. So the miner's wage really, he sees it as all his own, but it's really backed up by a lot of work that's going on in the home. So the main point that I want to communicate today is that what goes on in the home of coal miners is not domestic labour. It's not the same kinds of reproduction of labour that occurs in most working class and indeed middle class households. A large proportion of colliery household labour was what we call in the paper shift work. Its purpose was not to ensure comfort in the domestic sphere or to reproduce the miner's labour power, but to complete the industrial stint of work. And that this labour substituted for otherwise essential infrastructure, which was not provided by the colliery companies. And this effort propped up the collier's wage and subsidised colliery profits. And the effort was crucial to the implementation of the 24-hour system of working, which multiplied shift work and lengthened the women's working day. All right, methodology. You'd probably be interested in this if you are students working on these kinds of problems. We use in excess of 30 life accounts by miners' wives, by the children or the men themselves. Many of these are unpublished. For instance, Lottie Brennan's life story is an unpublished life account. Here, there's Elizabeth Andrews, A Woman's Work Is Never Done. She was the first Women Labour Party organiser in Wales, and she wrote a very interesting autobiography. And she also testified before various parliamentary investigations, so you can also find some of her comments in government documents. We also use collections of interviews and oral histories, and ethnographic and sociological studies, very famous ones, Dennis Enriques and Slaughter, for instance. Coal is Our Life. It's a famous sociological study which has got lots of really good accounts of coal mining family life in it. But the one I want to draw attention to, which turned out to be a real gold mine, no pun intended here, is a PhD by a man called Davies, who was actually the vicar in Deneby in the coal mining community that I grew up in. And he was a vicar there, and he went off to do a PhD, and he this must have, I don't know how he got this past the ethics committee, but he used his bereavement counselling notes to describe relationships in some of these households. And he got lots of notes and comments about family life from his bereavement notes and from his counselling of women in their intimate relationships and their spiritual activities. So we actually use these to document our case. What we do is we then move to a kind of quantification of this. We invent a rather standard inventory of domestic duties. We use modern techniques whereby you break jobs down into tasks in order to divide up the activities that women are doing. And we estimate the time required for each task. And we often do this, we do this sometimes by playing out the task ourselves. But we can also refer to other kinds of studies. So studies, for instance, the Soviets did a lot of studies of the time you needed to take to do various tasks. And there's also quite a lot of work done on rural housewives in the United States. So we could check those. We checked our totals against these kinds of sources. And then we use those multipliers that I already talked about, where we say, okay, now let's consider if there are two minors in the household, how does this act, what's the marginal addition to the labour time needed? And then when in fact those minors are not on the same shift, as they very often weren't, but on different shifts, what does that mean for the coal miner's wife? And so here's one of the things I want to zero in, one of the tasks I want to zero in today, and that's the shift bath. And this is Griselda Carr's account of what is involved in bathing the coal miner. And so she gives this account here. And that's a lovely picture of what is involved. But what I want to emphasize here is that this is not something that happens in all other households. This is specific to mining communities because the kind of filth and industrial dirt that the miner brings home is qualitatively different. It's not simply quantitatively different, it's qualitatively different. These are men who have been working there's no sanitation in a coal mine, there's shit, piss all around here. There's rats, there's cockroaches, there's the industrial filth that they bring home. And this is just ubiquitous in the women's accounts. Like B.L. Coombs, when he describes going to work in the Welsh coal mine, he describes how he uses a piece of paper around the handle of his cup so he can drink some tea before he's actually had his bath. And he describes too how his wife puts down sacks so that he doesn't trail too much dirt into their house. So this is really a different order of dirt that is being introduced into these households. And these men really do need to bathe before they can function in the family. And here's another account. This is an account recorded by Robert Arnott of how the work multiplies when you have more than one miner, and when that miner may be working a different shift. So here you see this woman, in the end, the alarm clock rings at 3 a.m. for another day, but she hasn't gone to bed before midnight. So this is the way in which the multipliers take place. Now, you don't really need to go through this in detail. You can, if you want, look at the paper, which is forthcoming in the Journal of Feminist Economics, and I think is out online shortly. But this is how we break the stint bath down, and we show how, minutes for the first miner, and then minutes for the second miner. And you can see we've rather scrupulously, for instance, we've counted carry the large wooden or tin bathtub and put it into place. Well, you don't need to do that if there's a second miner, so we can knock those minutes off for the second miner. So this is a kind of simple inventory of the 12 tasks that are required to bathe the miner, and we add up the minutes involved here, and you can see it's about an hour to bathe the first miner, and another 40 minutes for any second miner. The shift laundry is the next job that we looked at, and again, laundry is a very difficult task in all working class households in the 19th and 20th century. It takes a lot of work and effort in many of these households. But in the coal miner's household, it is qualitatively as well as quantitatively different, because his clothing and his kit needs to be cleaned more or less every day. Certainly something, the treasured garment of the coal miner, which is known as the pit drawers, his underpants, that has to be washed or cleaned or replaced every day. So this is not simply a once-a-week phenomenon. Plus, the once-a-week wash, or the twice-a-week wash in coal mining cases, is horrendously enlarged by the filth and dirt associated with the job. And you only have a casual encounter with the literature produced by coal mining families, produced by sociologists and anthropologists investigating coal mining, will tell you that this, looms large over the miner's household, and particularly the miner's wife. So doing the laundry is a huge job, and it's described in this way. So here again, we've got the tasks, but there's so much involved in laundry that we had to break it down into two, to get it to fit on a slide, into two lists. And we broke the shift laundry down into 30 independent tasks, and we've costed these up in terms of the minutes that they take too. And you can see here, we've also compared the shift laundry, the amount of time it takes to launder for a coal miner per shift, relative to domestic laundry, just the amount of time you would spend washing for a working class person. And again, here you've got a photograph that shows you, and these are some quotations from miners' wives themselves, and a photograph that shows you some of the tasks involved in cleaning the miner's kit. So I should emphasize here that it's not simply washing. You also have to beat the clothing initially in order to dislodge the dust and dirt. Then you have to empty out the pockets, which contain cockroaches and other kinds of insects, because you don't want them infesting your household. Bugs are a permanent problem in coal mining communities. The Denby picture again, that street was completely infested with bugs of various kinds, brought home from the pit, escaped before the wife could actually deal with them in the clothing, and living in the households then. And then, of course, preparing the food to take down to the coal mine next day, for example. So We summarise these tasks then into three categories. Number 3 at the bottom are the general domestic duties, which we assume were common to most homes, including, for example, to women who work the double shift in textile factories. And these come to just over 33 hours a week and account for only 45% of the labour hours worked in a miner's home in the long 19th century. The second category is what we refer to as disamenity labour. And this is the work that is imposed on miners' wives as a result of these defective infrastructure. So this is really to do with carrying coal, waste, water, etc. Sanitation in these communities lagged behind sanitation in the 19th, 20th century. Again, to go back to Deneby, that picture was from the 1960s, but the toilets were still outside in that. They were flush toilets by this time, but for long periods in the 19th century, they are in fact dry toilets. They're ash middens. This involves a lot of dealing with waste and sanitation. Of course, nursing is also imposed by the colliery companies, and later on, in fact, even by the National Coal Board on miners' wives. And then there's the colliery stint, and we see here is the bath, there's the maintaining the kit and the laundry, and then there's meals, because meals have to be prepared when the coal miner needs the food, when he comes off shift and so on. And of course a lot of cleaning of the floors, because the coal miner is bringing in dirt and dust. So what you see from this is that there are time costs which are specifically related to the kinds of infrastructure defects for which pit villages become increasingly notorious, and also that the shift work looms large in terms of the amount of time that the woman is spending relative to domestic labour per se. And we argue that there were three main consequences of this capture of household labour by the shift, by the industrial work itself. But before I discuss these, I want to just revisit the issue of the multipliers. So this table actually shows you what happens if you have a second miner. And that miner might mean that there are less overhead hours in the shift work because, for example, a younger son may use the same water as his father in the shift bath, and that may dramatically reduce the labour time involved by the wife. But he may not. So, this is some savings are possible here, but not all savings. We worked out what we thought a second miner on the same shift would add. But then, when the miners are working different shifts, you see how this then multiplies the woman's tasks and the time that she has to spend on the shift work. And, we work this out in terms of the total weekly labour hours, if two miners on one shift, if three miners on one shift, and so on. If two miners are on two shifts. And this then shows you, in fact, the way in which the colliery companies' use of continuous labour, the need to work 24 hours, which comes up against the physical endurance of individual coal miners, means that they have to introduce a shift system, and then the shift system is just elongating the woman's working day and piling extra hours of work on her in the household. Okay, and this then leads me on to embellishment and self-exploitation. And this has been noted by other historical sociologists, economic historians, as a way in which, but left us rather mysterious. Why did these women so dramatically present themselves as working in these strange and weird ways, chalking the step. That was actually quite common in coal mining communities, for instance. That means you put a line of chalk around your front door steps. As soon as anybody comes to the house, of course, it's scuffed up and you have to do it again. And what we argue in the paper is that this is a direct response to wanting to be, not merely to contribute, but to be seen to contribute. You have to challenge the idea that the wage is individual to justify sharing the wage. And this goes back, of course, to how the wage is paid and the notions of it being an individual reward to the individual miner, and how it's shared in the household. So there's some very funny accounts, both in the Reverend Davis's bereavement notes and in other mining accounts, of how women try to undermine the notion of the individualization of the wage. But there's also lots of material on how they really based themselves around making sure that the miner did nothing in the home. And that was the sign that they were actually contributing. So Reverend Davis's bereavement notes, for instance, make comments like, she lived for her husband. Her world revolved around her husband. And then women themselves say things like, he never lifted a finger in the household. And he never waited 5 minutes for his dinner. So this is completely a way of serving the miner in the home as a challenge to the idea that women were, as the miner remarked in one of those earlier slides, they were so lucky to not go to work. So this is the result of this. So we get the household earnings, the well-being of women and children, and we argue there are three main consequences of this capture of household labour. The capture of household labour had long-reaching effects. Miners insisted on personal service. Enriques and Slaughter comment on a case where a miner's wife's friend cooks him his dinner because she wants to go off to do some shopping. And the miner comes home and he throws the dinner on the fire. And he says, I'm not having a dinner cooked by somebody else. You are my wife, you cook me my dinner. So there's this idea that you cannot substitute out any kinds of domestic work. You have to do it yourself and be seen to do it. So miners insisted then on personal service from wives who embellished their roles in the way I described in a bid to appear indispensable. Therefore, in these communities, there's no significant outsourcing of domestic labour or other entrepreneurial by-employments, which elsewhere so often were the basis for a vibrant local economy, with multiplier effects on women's employment. This is one way in which these societies create a legacy of low female labour force participation then. And even after the era of pit closures, low labour force participation marks out ex-pit villages. So, but we're also arguing it's not simply that, it's but by displacing a stunning amount of industrial work on wives and daughters, any other activities are crowded out. So women cannot have a job or do something in the labour market because they are, in fact, completely exhausted by the requirements of the industrial activities of their husbands. The paper, as I say, does involve a comparison of mining and textile families, where we use census microdata to trace a family that breaks up and an offshoot goes to work in textile factories. And we use historically accurate evidence on earnings and on hours to actually compare the effort, the labour time that is put into the family's survival, and the compare what happens in the so-called breadwinner and the colliery community too. And what we find is that in colliery households, female hours generally exceeded male hours, whereas in textile households, female hours were typically less. Not because these women didn't work a double shift, but because their labour it was valuable because they could earn in the textile factories, and so it wasn't used in these grandiose ways as it was in the colliery communities. And the paper also has a section which looks at the legacy in terms of female participation today. We use here a PhD thesis by Yusheng Yu, produced in Cambridge in 2020, where he looks at female participation rates in coal mining communities and compares them with other kinds of regions. He argues, for instance, that historically females' labour force participation was demand determined, and so he argues that women's participation in coal mining communities is very low because there's no demand for women's work. But we would argue that in fact it's also low because women are actually working, but they're working for the coal industry by in fact doing all this work that's displaced from the coal community, from the coal colliery companies and from the miners themselves onto their unpaid onto their wives. So for generations then, a strong culture of male breadwinning hid the realisation that pit women had propped up the profitability of British mining long before and long after, by the way, it went into decline. If women in coal mining had been paid for their shift labour at a similar discount to that experienced by women in textiles, by our estimates, it would have added at least 15 to 20% to the shift wage. If the industry had instead invested in proper facilities much earlier, the idealised benefits of the high male wage might have been realised, sending Britain's coalfields into the industry's decline as one of the better educated and wealthier districts, instead of the reverse, instead of some of the more deprived, backward districts, poor educational facilities, poor transport facilities. Crucially, these communities would almost certainly have escaped the additional burden of a sticky gender trap and found it far easier to integrate into other labour markets when pits closed, and not yearned enthralled to coal like the people of Whitehaven are doing in terms of massively supporting this new coal mine that's to be opened in Whitehaven. So thank you very much. I hope we can have a discussion on the basis of some of these ideas.
Thank you very much indeed.